This show discusses wrongful convictions, which includes discussions about violent crimes. On Friday, the 5th of September 2003, a single gunshot wound ended the life of Aldonna Harris Vasquez. Immediately, all suspicion fell on the only person who was in the room with her, Lescene Edwards. The police started with suspicion, and the prosecution settled on a story that was salacious and simple. They said this was a trained police officer who killed the mother of his children and staged it to look like a suicide. The motive? Jealousy. The method? Deception. He forged a suicide note, and there was no gunshot residue on her hand, so she couldn't have fired the gun. From that day in 2003, Lescene Edwards has never wavered in what he said happened in that room. His case would have to go to the highest levels of the Jamaican justice system before the truth would come out. And it would take more than 19 years for his voice to be heard. What happens when the justice system gets it wrong? When innocent people are convicted and sent to prison? When they've exhausted all their appeals but still aren't free? Does that ever happen in Jamaica? How big a problem is it? Is there any help, any hope for people like that? I'm Andrew Wiles, and this is Stuck, a podcast exploring wrongful convictions in Jamaica, how they happen, who they impact, and what we can do about them.
Tell the judge, tell the jury, tell the news, them no hear me. Lose my mind, lose my time, lost my life nearly.
My name is Lescene Edwards. I was a police constable. I took great pride in protecting and serving. I was a father. I was a provider and someone who believed in justice. My life revolves around duty and family, especially my kids, who meant like everything to me. And I believe in the rule of law. I never imagined I would one day become a victim of a system that I once upheld.
Lescene had a girlfriend who he lived with, but Aldonna was the mother of his kids and they were still intimate. She had recently married a man from overseas. When her new husband was out at the island, Lescene would visit. On Friday, the 5th of September, he made one of those visits. Aldonna shared a house with her mom. When Lescene got there that day, he saw her mom first and greeted her.
When I went to the house, she was in the living room, right? And when I went in, I saw her and I said, "Where is Aldonna?" And she said, "Aldonna is in her bedroom." So I went in the bedroom and I saw Aldonna, right?
The mom stayed in the living room and Lescene went into Aldonna's bedroom. The mom said that some time passed and she fell asleep. Lescene Edwards says inside the bedroom, they had sex, but before he got into the bed, he removed his holster with his gun and put it on the dresser. After they were finished having sex, she got a call and he rolled over and fell asleep. Both Lescene and Aldonna's mom said that they were sleeping when they heard a loud bang that sounded like a gunshot.
When I hear the explosion and I jump up, I rushed towards the living room. The explosion waked me up and I rushed towards the living room and I saw the mother was just getting up. And I said, "Where's Pat?" And she said to me, "Then you're not in the room?"
Aldonna was nowhere to be seen in the bedroom, but inside the bedroom, there was a bathroom.
That was when I looked and I saw that the bathroom door was closed. And when I opened the door, she fell out. And same time I bawled out, Mama, Pat, kill herself with my gun." And she run, come around.
Lescene Edwards quickly called the police and waited on the scene for them to come. Even though he knew he was innocent, he realized when the police came on the scene that they didn't plan to treat him that way.
When the police came on the scene, and the most senior police officer on the scene, and I quote his words, he said, "We have to run this through the court." You understand? So he decided that this This would not stop at investigation. He had was to run it through the court. So in order to run this through the court, I would definitely have to be charged. So I'm saying by any means necessary, they will find something to charge me in order to run it through the court. Because his words that we have to run this through the court.
And you think that maybe because you're a police officer, they want to make it look like
Exactly.
they're not giving you any special favors.
Exactly.
If Lescene had any doubt about how the police were planning to treat with his case, all of it would have been removed when he went to the question and answer session.
They asked me things that never happened. Like, they told me that they got information that me and Aldonna fight. They told me that they got information that she thumped me in my eye and that I threatened her husband. I asked her for money to go to the hospital and all those things, and nothing like that never took place.
Lescene Edwards was soon charged for murdering the mother of his children, Aldonna Harris Vasquez, and so began a journey to clear his name.
Everything changed, the instant that I was wrongfully arrested, Everything changed. The instant I was wrongly charged with murder of my children's mother, this woman who tragically take her own life with my service revolver. Because you have to remember it's my gun she used, And so tragically it rests on me.
The charge came quickly, but it then took more than 10 years for the trial to start in 2013. It was around this time that I first met Lescene Edwards. I was a legal intern for Valerie Nita Robertson, who was one of Lescene Edwards' lawyers. I was in court every day of the trial, sitting in counsel's bench, taking the notes of evidence for the attorneys, even passing messages between Mr. Edwards, who was in the dock, and his lawyers as needed. The trial ended just before I was called to the bar as an attorney in Jamaica. At the trial, the prosecution's case was clear-cut. Lescene Edwards was the only person with her in the bedroom. After the explosion, he ran out asking for her, which was kind of strange because he was the only person with her in the bedroom. It was his gun. When he saw the body, he picked up the gun and then dropped it back in her lap. As a police officer, he would have known better. More than that, he wasn't just a normal police officer, he was a crime scene officer, and so he should have known better and would have known better. A police officer who observed him said that his crying seemed fake. Then there was the science. There was no gunshot residue on her hand, which means she could not have fired the gun. Also, there was the issue of the suicide note. It was perhaps the most suspicious thing in the world. First, a police officer says it was Lescene Edwards who pointed it out to the police. And most important of all, they had a handwriting expert who looked at the handwriting of Aldonna Harris Vasquez and looked at the handwriting of Lescene Edwards. The expert told the jury that it was not Aldonna, but Lescene who wrote the suicide note. The jury went to the house itself. This was one of the most dramatic, the most exciting experiences of my legal career. The whole court, the judge, the jury, police outriders loaded into buses and cars and drove from the Supreme Court downtown to the location. They stood inside the house. They saw the living room. They saw the bathroom. They saw it with their own eyes. Surely that was enough. And for 11 of 12 jurors, it was enough. Yes, 11 out of 12 isn't unanimous, but by Jamaican law, it is enough.
That broke me. That day broke me inside. Standing in the courtroom hearing the verdict, I felt the world crash down on me. It was the loss of my freedom, my dignity, and my very identity.
Former policeman Lescene Edwards has been sentenced to life in prison for the 2003 murder of his ex-girlfriend Aldonna Harris in Pembroke Hall, St. Andrew. Senior Puny Judge Gloria Smith has ordered Edwards to serve 35 years before he becomes eligible for parole.
He was once proud of the title and the achievement of being a police officer, but in prison, that identity would be a problem.
I was no longer seen as a man or a father, but in prison I was like a target because, prisoners know because my case was highly publicized. So before I went to prison, prisoner was there waiting to see who is this policeman coming in that killed his children's mother. Yeah. When I look outside at the prison yard, hundreds of prisoners was there standing, looking up to see who is this man. And when they get a glimpse of me, all I see was threatening body language, threatening body language. So I was very intimidated and nervous. For 1 week, I don't come out of the cell where they put me in. I don't bathe for a week. I was afraid to walk on the block. So it wasn't easy at all. It was terrible.
And it wasn't just the danger that made prison hard. Lescene was sent to serve his time at the Tower Street Adult Correctional Center, or General Penitentiary, or simply GP, as Jamaican people know it. The conditions at GP under which the prisoners live are notorious.
You have at least three persons in a cell. A cell is like 6 feet by 8 feet, and 3 persons in that space, and you have to do everything in that space because you lock them like 17 hours out of the 24-hour day. Everything you have to do in that space, everything, and there is chink on the wall. You can literally see the chink cover the wall. The stench. Everything is inhumane. No human being, no matter what them do, should be put into a place like that. Especially when you are an innocent man. So that can drive up your mental issue. Because remember, you never do what them say you do, and then put you in a place like this. You understand? So it drives you to madness.
Locked away for life, Lescene's losses began to pile up. Remember, it took more than 10 years for this matter to come to a trial. He eventually got married the same year that he was put on trial and sent to prison. But about 3 years into his sentence, perhaps about 32 more years to go, the separation and the uncertainty proved to be too much for his wife.
My wife leave. She said she can't hold out no more. She called me on Christmas Day, I think, and said, well, she can't do this no more. And all I said to her, well, you have to do what you have to do. If I was a weak person, that would help break me more. And it did break me a little, but I still stand up because my kids were more important to me at that point.
As determined as he was to stand for his kids, he was in and they were out. He couldn't be there for them personally, physically, to watch them grow. He couldn't be there for other family members or even to deal with his own affairs.
I did not live for 19 years. I was just like a matter going through this world. You understand? I lost birthdays, I lost school reports, I lose out. My father died, other family members died, my brother, I had a brother that died during the time, and I applied to go to the funeral and them didn't send me. So I lost a lot of things during those 19 years. I lost my house, I lost my vehicles. I lose everything.
I mean, all your children are adults now?
Yeah, all of them are adults now.
When a person is convicted of a crime in Jamaica, either by a judge or a jury, or if they plead guilty, that conviction is not always the end of the matter. If somebody in that position feels like they didn't get a fair shake, and the law allows it, they can appeal to the Court of Appeal. Lescene Edwards took the opportunity to appeal to Jamaica's Court of Appeal. There were serious problems with his case, and though it took a while for the Court of Appeal to get to him, he had 3 of Jamaica's top lawyers arguing in his favor. He would also have to wait for the Court of Appeal to make up its mind, but altogether, he had high hopes that finally justice would prevail.
But in 2019, my appeal was dismissed. So that moment shattered me to the core. I felt abandoned, I felt that the very system that I served disappointed me, and it put me into a state of depression. I felt lost. I thought the world was just had forgotten me. And I wondered if I would ever see freedom again.
But he would see freedom again. And not just freedom, vindication, full exoneration, though we may not necessarily use that word in our legal system.
Police Constable Lescene Edwards, who was convicted 8 years ago for the murder of his children's mother, has been freed by the United Kingdom-based Privy Council. In its judgment, the Privy Council criticized the government for the long delay in trying the case and the government's lack of resources in providing expert evidence for accused persons.
Obviously, I've only told you half the story. Some of what the prosecution had to say against Lescene Edwards, some of what the police did, and some of what he suffered. We haven't spoken about what he had to say in his defense and how he was eventually set free. But before we come to that, we need to talk about wrongful convictions. Only 2 people are in a room. A gun goes off. One of them dies. There are 2 plausible explanations. The police choose to pick one of the explanations over the other. The reason the police choose explanation 1 over explanation number 2 is very important for our consideration of this topic of wrongful convictions. If you want to understand wrongful convictions in Jamaica, there is no better place to start than the case of Lescene Edwards. It's a great case because you can see in it all the key lessons that we need to learn about wrongful convictions, how they happen, who they impact, what we can do about them. It helps us to see and to talk about and to distinguish between the categories of wrongful convictions. And we're going to talk about that in a bit. It helps us in talking about the wrongfully convicted. They fall into 2 categories. It illustrates for us the role that different players play in the criminal justice system and how those players contribute to wrongful convictions when they drop the ball. Players like police investigators, the prosecution, the trial judge, judges on the Court of Appeal. Lescene's experience and also what he says dives right into the debate about the Privy Council versus the CCJ. I have been hearing the arguments about the Privy Council versus the CCJ since before I was a law student in 2008. Maybe someone has said it, but I've never heard or thought about the point that Lescene Edwards makes in his interview to me. Lescene Edwards' case shows the predicament of the wrongfully convicted on an appeal. Even if you are able at some later date to prove your innocence, that doesn't necessarily mean that a court will allow you to do that, which makes talking about how to prevent wrongful convictions just as important as figuring out how to fix them. Lescene Edwards' case is one of the most interesting categories of wrongful convictions, an imagined crime or a no-crime wrongful conviction. I wanted to hear really quickly from 2 professors who I've interviewed for this podcast and whose full podcast episodes we will air soon. One from Canada, one from the US. Both have done a tremendous amount of work educating the public about this very surprising category of wrongful convictions. First, Professor Kent Roach, professor at the University of Toronto. I started thinking about wrongful convictions in Jamaica when I read his book, Wrongfully Convicted, Guilty Pleas, Imagined Crimes, and What Canada Must Do to Safeguard Justice. It's a great book and I'm doing a full review by itself. But what you need to know right now is that he gives 3 categories that wrongful convictions fall into: false guilty plea, wrongful convictions; wrong person, wrongful convictions; and imagined crimes, wrongful convictions. Lescene Edwards' case is that last category, an imagined crime.
I think when we think about wrongful convictions, I think most people understandably think of you get the wrong person, right? Crime was committed, but you have the wrong person. One of the things that both the Canadian and the American registry has revealed is a lot of wrongful convictions, about a third, are cases where it appears like no crime has actually been committed. So these are cases involving accidental deaths, sometimes the accidental or undetermined deaths of a new child. You can see in those circumstances where the police and the experts might say, well, the person looking after this vulnerable child may very well be responsible for their deaths. And I served as the research director on the Gouge Commission, where we looked at 11 wrongful convictions in Ontario, where people were either convicted or gave up and pled guilty for killing small children on the basis of expert evidence from a pathologist that, when it was eventually reviewed by better trained forensic pathologists, they said, this is not a murder. This is a case of a child dying from a disease, or sometimes, unfortunately, children die for reasons that cannot be completely determined.
And there's Professor Jessica Henry. She wrote the book Smoke But No Fire, Convicting the Innocent of Crimes That Never Happened. Jessica Henry spent 10 years as a public defender before moving on to teach a course on wrongful convictions. When she discovered this crazy thing, she had to write a book about it.
There's an organization called the National Registry of Exonerations, and they track all of the American exonerations that have occurred since 1989. And so I would, in preparing my class, often just kind of poke around the National Registry of Exonerations database. And I was looking up one case, and it was designated, they have different classifications, and you can sort the data. And so I looked at a case, and it was a no-crime wrongful conviction. So I thought, okay, yeah, that makes sense. And then I sort of clicked more to find out more information. And what I realized, and I was shocked, was that 1/3 of all the convictions in the National Registry of Exonerations at that time, 1/3 involved crimes that never happened in the first place. And I actually thought I was wrong. I thought I must have been sorting the data incorrectly. That couldn't possibly be right. And so I contacted them, and sure enough, it was correct. And today, in 2025, 40% of all known exonerations involve a person who was wrongly convicted of a crime that never happened. And I want to pause on that for a minute, because I was absolutely gobsmacked. I could not believe that was correct. I think when most people think about wrongful convictions, in general, they think about a crime having occurred and the wrong person being convicted of that crime. Yet there are so many people who are wrongly convicted of something that just didn't even happen. And I knew, as soon as I saw that statistic, I knew I needed to know more. And so that's how I came to write my book, Smoke But No Fire, Convicting the Innocent of Crimes That Never Happened. And I looked at sort of how this thing has come to pass. And we know about individual cases, but I think what was significant about what I realized is that this is not just one person here and one person there. There is a phenomenon going on. There is a pattern of people being pulled into the criminal legal system who should never have been there in the first place.
Wow. How do you find people receive this information? How does it affect people's understanding of the criminal justice system? Because you have been talking about this, sharing your work, sharing your book. Do you find that people are surprised to find out that, just as you were surprised to find out that here is this whole category of people who are convicted and no crime occurred?
Yeah, I think people are really shocked by it.
Professor Roach talks about how with imagined crimes, there tend to be certain mindsets that contribute to them happening. There are certain ways of thinking that cause the police and investigators to see something that's an accident that has a natural or innocent explanation and to decide that it's a crime. He describes one of those mindsets as thinking dirty.
You were mentioning a case where a man was convicted of killing his wife. And this is part of a phenomena that I talk about called thinking dirty, that I think sometimes if a person might have a motive to commit a crime, the police and sometimes the expert witnesses, the judge, the jury, they sometimes leap to the conclusion, well, they must have done it. And this was a case that went all the way. And the Privy Council said, well, in light of this new evidence, we think that this this was a suicide. And, you know, that's an interesting case, because my understanding of the case is that there was a suicide note, right? So you would think that the police would maybe accept that this was a suicide, but they believed, and I guess they were thinking dirty, they believed that the accused forged the suicide note. And so my understanding of the case, and Andrew, you may know this case better than I, but that the accused spent whatever money he had trying to get a handwriting expert to prove that he didn't write his ex-wife's now deceased suicide note. And one of the things the Privy Council did is they admitted new forensic evidence, which is often crucial in these cases of imagined crimes or crimes that did not happen.
In his book, he argues that thinking dirty tends to be especially prevalent in cases where there is some sex in the story. In fact, while reading the book, I thought about Lescene Edwards when Professor Roach wrote about a man called Clayton Johnson. Clayton Johnson lived in Canada. He was a church-going father of two, married to his high school sweetheart. He worked at the local high school. One day he left for work, and while he was out, his neighbors found his wife lying at the bottom of some stairs. She died. The police investigated, and at first, everyone believed and accepted that it was an accident. Police, the doctor, the whole community. Things changed shortly after when Mr. Johnson started to date a younger woman. Soon, the rumor mill started to churn and gossip spread that he had taken out this life insurance policy on his wife. People started to put two and two together, and the police reopened the case. They investigated and then they closed the case. But then this one policeman took it upon himself because, as I said, the rumor mill is churning because the man has a younger woman dating in his life so soon after his wife has died. The policeman now goes back to re-interview the two women who had cleaned up the scene, and now their story changed. Suddenly they remembered a lot more blood than they did at first. He gets this new, more graphic description in statements and brings that to some experts. The experts don't get the full case file with what the original investigators said. They only get this new description. So, based on all this blood that the women have described, the experts change their opinions and say this is murder. That amount of blood could only come from a beating and not a simple fall. The investigation and the trial skipped evidence and went all the way to motive. He killed his wife to be with his young lover and to collect a life insurance policy. It was too good to resist. Based on the new evidence and the testimony of the experts, the jury believed and convicted Clayton Johnson. Still, he didn't stop fighting for his innocence. He didn't stop insisting that he was innocent. And sometime after, a group, which is now Innocence Canada, took up his case. It cost him 500,000 Canadian dollars to exhume his wife's body. And when they checked the body again, the examination confirmed what everyone had said originally. It was an accident. He got 2.5 million Canadian dollars as compensation. But who could give him back the 5 years that he lost and the 5 years that he spent in prison and the time away from his young daughters? That case shows how tempting it is to think dirty when there are certain facts in the story, and how thinking dirty can stop us from thinking clearly.
What should have been investigated as a suicide now becomes a nightmare for me. I was cast as a murderer. I was shocked, heartbroken, confused. You know, my character was attacked, my reputation destroyed, and my children were left without a mother. And sooner after that, without a father.
So, what did thinking dirty look like in the case of Lescene Edwards? And what was this evidence that was so compelling that it caused the Privy Council to take an extraordinary step to call on the government of Jamaica to compensate Lescene Edwards? That's next time on Stuck.
Mrs. Leake's evidence is it's pretty well impossible to explain how, if this was murder, The murderer manages to get out and a few minutes later be in the living room with not a trace of blood on him.
Hey, thanks for listening. Stuck is written and presented by me, Andrew Wiles. It is brought to you by The Wave on the Frequency Network. Subscribe to Stuck wherever you get your podcasts. You can read more about the project at andrewwiles.com. And if you found the conversation interesting or helpful, share it. Thanks for tuning in. Until next time. This podcast is for information only. It's not legal advice. The people you hear are sharing their own opinions. If you think you need legal help, you have to get an attorney. This show discusses wrongful convictions, which includes discussions about violent crimes.